Chapter 1 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 1, Conspiracies in the North. Opposition to the government by constitutional means was not enough to gratify the vehement and resentful feelings of those Democrats in the North whose zeal for slavery seemed completely to have destroyed in their hearts every impulse of patriotism. They were ready to do the work of the Southern Confederacy in the North, and were alone prevented by their fear of the law. To evade the restraints of justice and the sharp measures of the military administration, they formed throughout the country secret associations for the purpose of resisting the laws, of embarrassing in every way the action of the government, of communicating information to the rebels in arms, and in many cases of inflicting serious damage on the lives and property of the Unionists. They adopted various names in different parts of the country, but the designation chosen by the society having the largest number of lodges in the several states was the Knights of the Golden Circle. As fast as one name was discovered and published, it was cast aside and another adopted, and the same organization with the same membership appeared successively under the name we have mentioned, and those of the Order of American Knights, the Order of the Star, and the Sons of Liberty. These secret organizations possessed a singular charm to uneducated men, independent of their political sympathies, and this attraction, combined with the fact that they could not in plain daylight inflict any injury upon the government, drove many thousands of the lower class of Democrats into these furtive lodges. It is impossible to ascertain with any degree of exactness the numbers of those who became affiliated with the orders. The numbers claimed by the adepts vary widely. 1,000,000 was not infrequently the membership of which they boasted. Mr. Vallandigham asserted in a public speech that the organized body numbered 500,000. Judge Holt, in his official report, accepted this aggregate as being something near the truth. The heaviest force was in Illinois and in Indiana. In Ohio they were also very numerous, and in the border states of Kentucky and Missouri their organization was entirely military. The state lodges were commanded by major generals, the congressional districts by brigadiers, the counties by colonels, and the townships by captains. They drilled as much as was possible under the limitations of secrecy. They made large purchases of arms. General H.B. Carrington estimated that 30,000 guns and revolvers were brought into Indiana alone, and the adherents of the order in the State of Illinois were also fully armed. In the month of March, 1864, it was estimated that the entire armed force of the order, capable of being mobilized for active service, was 340,000 men. It is altogether probable that this estimate was greatly exaggerated, and even if so large a number had been initiated into the order, their lack of drill, discipline, and moral character rendered them incapable of at any time of acting as an army. The order was large enough, at least, to offer the fullest hospitality to detectives and to Union men who volunteered to join with the purpose of reporting what they could to the authorities, so that the government was speedily put in possession of the entire scheme of organization, with the names of the prominent officers of the order and written copies of their constitutions, oaths, and books of ritual. The constitutions of secret societies are generally valuable only as illustrations of human stupidity, and these were no exception to the rule. Their declaration of principles begins with the lucid proposition: all men are endowed by the Creator with certain rights, equal as far as there is equality in the capacity for the appreciation, enjoyment, and exercise of those rights. The institution of slavery receives the approval of this band of midnight traitors in the following muddled and brutal sentences: In the divine economy, no individual of the human race must be permitted to encumber the earth, to mar its aspects of transcendent beauty, nor to impede the progress of the physical or intellectual man, neither in himself nor in the race to which he belongs. Hence a people whom neither the divinity within them nor the inspirations of divine and beautiful nature around them can impel to virtuous action and progress onward and upward, should be subjected to a just and humane servitude and tutelage to the superior race until they shall be able to appreciate the benefits and advantages of civilization. They also declare in favor of something they imagine to be the theory of state rights, and also the duty of the people to expel their rulers from the government by force of arms when they see good reason. This is not revolution, they say, but solely the assertion of right. Had they been content to meet in their lodges at stated times and bewilder themselves by such rhetoric as this, there would have been no harm done. But there is plenty of evidence that the measures they adopted to bring what they called their principles into action were of positive injury to the national welfare. One of their chief objects was the exciting of discontent in the army and the encouraging of desertion. Members of the order enlisted with the express purpose of inciting soldiers to desert with them. Money and citizens' clothing were furnished them for this purpose. Lawyers were hired to advise soldiers on leave not to go back, and to promise them the requisite defense in the courts if they got into trouble by desertion. The Adjutant General of Indiana, in his report for 1863, says that the number of deserters and absentees returned to the Army through the post of Indianapolis alone during the last month of 1862 was about 2,600. The squads of soldiers sent to arrest deserters were frequently attacked in rural districts by these organized bodies. The most violent resistance was made to the enrollment and the draft. Several enrolling officers were shot in Indiana and in Illinois. About 60 persons were tried and convicted in Indiana for conspiracy to resist the draft. A constant system of communication with the rebels in arms was kept up across the border. Arms, ammunition, and in some instances recruits were sent to aid the Confederates. Secret murders and assassinations were not unknown. The plan of establishing a Northwestern Confederacy in hostility to the East and in alliance with the Southern Confederacy was the favorite dream of the malignant and narrow minds controlling the order. The government wisely took little notice of the proceedings of these organizations. It was constantly informed of their general plans and purposes. The Grand Secretary of the order in Missouri made a full confession of his connection with it. In August, a large number of copies of the Ritual of the Order of American Knights was seized in an office which had been occupied by a prominent Democratic politician at Terre Haute. A private soldier in the Union Army named Stidger had himself initiated into the order, and with infinite skill and success rose to a high position in it, becoming Grand Secretary for the State of Kentucky. Thus thoroughly informed of the composition and purposes of the society, the government was constantly able to guard against any serious disturbances of the public peace. And whenever the arrest of any of the ringleaders was determined upon, the evidence for their conviction was always overwhelming. The fullest light was thrown upon the organization and plans of these treasonable orders by the trials of certain conspirators in Indiana in the autumn of 1864. We will make no reference to the testimony of government detectives who joined the conspiracy with the purpose of revealing its secrets. It is sufficient to quote the unwilling and unquestionably truthful statements of members of the order brought into court by subpoena. William Clayton, a farmer of Warren County, Illinois, testified that he was initiated a member of the Order of American Knights at a congregation formed in the timber. He took a long and bombastic oath, the only significant part of which was the pledge to take up arms, if required, in the cause of the oppressed, against usurpers waging war against a people endeavoring to establish a government for themselves in accordance with the eternal principles of truth. This, he testified, bound him to assist the South in its struggle for independence. He said he understood the purpose of the order was primarily to beat the Republicans at the polls, and that force of arms was to be resorted to in case of necessity; that they contemplated a rebel invasion in support of these objects; that the understanding was that in case the rebels came into Illinois, they and the brethren of this organization were to shake hands and be friends; that they were to give aid and assistance to the invaders; that death was the penalty for divulging the secrets of the order. Other members testified that they took an oath providing that in case of treachery they were to be drawn and quartered, their mangled remains to be cast out at the 4 gates. When these dwellers in prairie villages were asked what they meant by the 4 gates, they said they did not know. Clayton further said their objects were to resist the conscription or anything else that pushed them too hard. Another farmer said he joined because he had been a Democrat all his life; another that he went in out of curiosity, and this was doubtless a motive with many. In communities where there is little to interest an idle mind, these secret mummeries possess a singular attraction. The grips, the passwords, the emblems, formed a great part of whatever temptation the order offered to the rural conspirators. Their favorite cognizance was the oak, not on account of any civic association, but because the word was formed of the initials of the name, Order of American Knights. Their grand hailing cry of distress was Oak Hound, the last syllable taken from the name of the South Carolina statesman whose principles they imagined they were putting in operation. By far the most important witness for the government was Horace Heffron, a lawyer of Salem, Indiana, a man high in the councils of the order. He was indicted for treasonable practices and concluded to make a clean breast of it. He gave an apparently truthful account, detailed the scheme for forming a Northwestern Confederacy, or, if that failed, for joining the Southern Army. The State government of Indiana was to be seized. Governor Morton was to be held for a hostage or killed. He confirmed the story of the general uprising which was to have taken place on the 16th of August in conjunction with a rebel raid from Cumberland Gap, the great feature of which was the liberation of the Confederate prisoners in Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana. But when the time came, the rebels did not, and the conspirators lacked heart for the fight. Vallandigham, the supreme head of the order, was too far away for intelligent and efficient direction. The whole conspiracy was shabby and puerile, although it included many editors and politicians of local standing. They were not all cravens. Some of them stood up stoutly before the military commission and defended the cause of the South. "I assert," said one, "that the South has been fighting for their rights, as defined in the Dred Scott decision." But there was very little display of heroism when the time of trial arrived. There was much that was ignoble and sordid, a scramble for the salary places, a rush to handle the money provided for arms, one man intriguing for a place on the staff because he had a sore leg, a cloud of small politicians who hardly knew whether they were members or not. They had heard a ritual read, but paid little attention to it. They were anxious to be members if the scheme succeeded, and to avoid the law if it failed. The President's attitude in regard to this organization was one of good-humored contempt rather than anything else. Most of the officers commanding departments, however, regarded the machinations of these dark lantern knights as a matter of the deepest import. Governor Morton was greatly disquieted by their work in his State, and sent a telegram to the President in January, 1863, expressing his fear that the Legislature, when it met, would pass a joint resolution to acknowledge the Southern Confederacy and urge the Northwest to dissolve all constitutional relation with the New England States. But when the Legislature came together, although it evinced a hearty goodwill in giving the governor all the worry and annoyance possible, it took no such overt step of treason as he feared. Their action was indeed sufficiently violent and contumacious. The House of Representatives insolently returned his message to him, and passed a resolution accepting in its stead that of the Democratic governor of New York. Measures were introduced to take the military power of the State away from the governor, and to confer it upon the Democratic State officers. To defeat these unconstitutional proceedings, the Republicans adopted the equally irregular course of abandoning the Legislature and leaving it without a quorum, in consequence of which no appropriation bills were passed, and the governor had to appeal to the people of the State for the means to carry on the government. These were furnished in part by the voluntary offerings of banks, private corporations, and individuals, but needing $250,000 for an emergency, he came to Washington and obtained it from the General Government by virtue of a statute of July 31, 1861, which set aside $2 millions for the purchase of munitions of war to be used in States in rebellion, or in which rebellion is or may be threatened. In view of the revolutionary attitude of the Legislature and the known treasonable organization and purposes of the Sons of Liberty, the Secretary of War decided that Indiana was so threatened, and made Governor Morton a disbursing officer to the amount of $250,000. It is related that Morton remarked, as he took the warrant, if the cause failed, they would be called heavily to account for this, to which Stanton replied, "If the cause fails, I do not wish to live." In the summer of 1864, General Rosecrans made a full discovery of the purposes and organization of these conspirators, and communicated it to Governor Yates of Illinois, who fully shared his solicitude. They joined in an earnest demand that the President should order Colonel J.P. Sanderson of Rosecrans's staff to Washington for a personal interview upon matters of overwhelming importance. Stanton objected to this, and the President was unwilling that either Rosecrans or his subordinate should come to Washington upon such an errand, under the temptation to magnify his office by alarming reports. He therefore concluded to send one of his own private secretaries to St. Louis to see precisely what were the facts which had thrown the general commanding into such a state of concern. Rosecrans then repeated the entire story of the organization of the Order of American Knights and the Golden Circle, facts which were already well known to the President and the Secretary of War. But the immediate cause of his excitement was the expected return of Vallandigham, which he said was in accordance with the resolution adopted by the order at the convocation held in Windsor, Canada. General Rosecrans thought that his return would be the signal for the rising of the Knights throughout the Northwest and for serious public disorders. The President, on receiving his secretary's report, declined to order Sanderson to Washington, and in reference to Rosecrans's strict injunctions of secrecy, he said that a secret confided on the one side to 500,000 Democrats and on the other to 5 governors and their staffs was hardly worth keeping. He said the northern section of the conspiracy merited no special attention, being about an equal mixture of puerility and malice. General Rosecrans, after he was convinced that the President would not overrule the Secretary of War by ordering Colonel Sanderson to Washington, concluded at last to send his voluminous report in manuscript, accompanying it with the following letter, which we copy as giving in few words the results of his researches. Since Major Hay's departure, bearing my letter about the secret conspiracy we have been tracing out, we have added much information of its Southern connections, operations, uses, and intentions. We have also found a new element in its workings under the name of McClellan Minutemen. The evident extent and anti-national purposes of this great conspiracy compel me to urge the consideration of what ought to be done to anticipate its workings and prevent the mischief it is capable of producing again upon your attention. Therefore, I have sent the report of Colonel Sanderson with the details of evidence, covering 1,000 pages of foolscap by himself, to be carried or forwarded to you by safe hands. That report and its accompanying papers show, 1. That there exists an oath-bound secret society under various names, but forming one brotherhood both in the rebel and loyal States, the objects of which are the overthrow of the existing national government and the dismemberment of this nation. 2. That the secret oaths bind these conspirators to revolution and all its consequences of murder, arson, pillage, and an untold train of crimes, including assassination and perjury, under the penalty of death to the disobedient or recusant. 3. That they intend to operate in conjunction with rebel movements this summer to revolutionize the loyal States if they can. 4. That Vallandigham is the supreme commander of the northern wing of the society, and General Price of the rebel army the supreme commander of the southern wing of the organization, and that Vallandigham's return was a part of the program well understood both North and South, by which the revolution they proposed was to be inaugurated. 5. That this association is now and has been the principal agency by which spying and supplying rebels with means of war are carried on between the loyal and rebel States, and that even some of our officers are engaged in it. 6. That they claim to have 20,000 members in Missouri, 140,000 in Illinois, 100,000 in Indiana, 80,000 in Ohio, 70,000 in Kentucky, and that they are extending through New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. Besides which prominent and general facts, the names of members, mode of operating, and other details appear fully, showing what a formidable power and what agencies for mischief we have to deal with. With this synopsis of the report, it is respectfully submitted with the single remark, that whatever orders you may deem best to give, it must be obvious to your Excellency that leading conspirators like Charles L. Hunt and Dr. Shore of St. Louis, arrested for being implicated in the association, cannot be released without serious hazard to the public welfare and safety. From first to last, these organizations were singularly lacking in energy and initiative. The only substantial harm they did was in encouraging desertions and embarrassing and resisting the officers concerned in the enrollment and the draft. The toleration with which the President regarded them, and the immunity which he allowed them in their passive treason, arose from the fact that he never could be made to believe that there was as much crime as folly in their acts and purposes. Senator McDonald reports that the President once said to him, when he was asking the pardon of some of these conspirators condemned by military commission, "Nothing can make me believe that 100,000 Indiana Democrats are disloyal." They were sufficiently disloyal to take all manner of oaths against the government, to declare in their secret councils they were ready to shed the last drop of their blood to abolish it, to express their ardent sympathy with its enemies and their detestation of its officers and supporters. But this was the limit of their criminal courage. Shedding the last drop of one's blood is a comparatively easy sacrifice. It is shedding the first drop that costs, and these rural Catalines were never quite ready to risk their skins for their so-called principles. Most of the attempts against the public peace in the free States and on the northern border proceeded not from the resident conspirators, but from desperate Southern emissaries and their aiders and abettors in the British provinces, and even these rarely rose above the level of ordinary arson and highway robbery. The case of the Chesapeake was one of the most noteworthy of these incidents. Two Canadians named J.C. Braine and H.A. Parr resolved in the latter part of 1863 to start on a privateering enterprise on their own account. Parr, though born in Canada, had lived for several years in Tennessee, and Braine, who had been arrested and confined in Fort Warren, had been released from that prison on his claim, represented by the British minister, that he was a British subject. Their sole pretension to Confederate nationality was the possession of commissions in the Confederate Navy prepared ad hoc. They enlisted a dozen men, all British subjects, purchased in New York the arms and equipment they required for their enterprise, and took passage on board the United States merchant steamer Chesapeake, which left New York on the 5th of December, bound for Portland, Maine. On the morning of the 8th they assaulted the officers and crew of the Chesapeake, capturing her after a struggle of only a few minutes' duration, killing one and wounding two of her officers. They took the Chesapeake into the Bay of Fundy, and there delivered her into the hands of a man calling himself Captain Parker of the Confederate Navy, who afterwards turned out to be an Englishman whose name was Vernon Locke, and who had come out in a pilot boat to meet her. Feeling now secure in the possession of her new nationality, she went to Sambro Harbor, Nova Scotia, to receive the fuel and supplies necessary to enable her to prosecute her voyage to the Confederate States. While she lay there, the United States gunboat Ella and Annie entered the harbor, and, says Mr. Benjamin, whose righteous indignation was evidently aroused by the proceedings, with that habitual contempt of the territorial sovereignty of Great Britain and of her neutral rights which characterizes our enemies, recaptured the prize and left the British port with the purpose of taking the Chesapeake to the United States. But meeting on the way a superior officer of the United States Navy, the captain of the Ella and Annie was ordered by him to return to Halifax to restore the Chesapeake to the jurisdiction of Great Britain. This was done, and the few pirates who had been captured in the Chesapeake were delivered up. The case was taken at once into the courts and was promptly and properly decided, so far as the vessel was concerned, by her delivery to her rightful owners. But before this decision was made known at Richmond, the Confederate government, seeing in the case a possibility of profit to their cause, dispatched to Halifax Professor J.P. Holcomb, said to be the most accomplished international lawyer in the Confederacy, to take charge of the case. During the professor's transit, however, by way of Wilmington and Bermuda, the case had come to its natural close, and on arriving at Halifax he found his occupation gone. He was compelled to report to the department that every man concerned in the capture of the Chesapeake, with the single exception of the Canadian Tennessean just mentioned, was a British subject. He also found that the captors had been guilty of stealing and peddling the cargo and pocketing the proceeds, and that the antecedents of the so-called Confederate officers involved were most disreputable. He seemed greatly disappointed to find that this gang of murderers and thieves were not high-minded and honorable gentlemen, and therefore concluded to make no demand upon the British authorities for the restitution of the stolen ship. He remained for some time in Halifax, enjoying the hospitality of the colonial sympathizers with the South, and then proceeded to join the other secession emissaries in Canada who were engaged in equally congenial enterprises. The principal agent of the Confederates in Canada was Jacob Thompson, Secretary of the Interior in the late administration of Buchanan, whose treasonable conduct of that important office has already been mentioned. He had sunk into appropriate insignificance even among his own associates after the war began, had been captured by General Grant on the Mississippi River in a ridiculous attempt at playing the spy under a flag of truce, and after being released with contemptuous forbearance, had gone to Canada under instructions from the rebel government to do what damage he could in connection with the refugees and escaped prisoners who fringed the northern frontier during the last 2 years of the war. He immediately placed himself in communication with the disloyal Democrats of the Northern States, and through them and a band of refugees who at once gathered about him in Canada for employment, began a series of operations which, for their folly no less than their malignity, would be incredible if they were not recorded in the report which Thompson himself, with amazing moral obtuseness, wrote of his mission on the 3rd of December, 1864. He states that immediately on his arrival in Canada, he put himself in communication with the leading spirits of the Sons of Liberty. He was received among them with cordiality, and the greatest confidence was extended to him. They became convinced during the summer of 1864 that their efforts to defeat the election of Mr. Lincoln were hopeless. Lincoln had the power, he said, and would certainly reelect himself, and there was no hope but in force. The belief was entertained and freely expressed that by a bold, vigorous, and concerted movement the 3 great Northwestern States of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio could be seized and held. This being done, the States of Kentucky and Missouri could easily be lifted from their prostrate condition and placed on their feet, and this in 60 days would end the war. It was resolved to hold a series of peace meetings in Illinois for the purpose of preparing the public mind for such a revolt. The first of these meetings was to be held at Peoria, and to make it a success, says Thompson, I agreed that so much money as was necessary would be furnished by me. It was held and was decidedly successful. But he pretends that the Niagara Falls Conference and Lincoln's letter, to whom it may concern, shocked the country to such an extent that the leading politicians conceived the idea that Lincoln might be beaten at the ballot box on such an issue. The nerves of the leaders, he says, thereupon began to relax. The seizure of arms at Indianapolis, the arrest of leading supporters at Louisville, the unsympathetic attitude of Mr. McDonald, the Democratic candidate for governor of Indiana, all tended to discourage the ringleaders, and the day fixed for the revolt, which was to have been the 16th of August, passed by with no demonstration. The necessity of pandering to the military feeling which resulted in the nomination of McClellan totally demoralized, says Thompson, the Sons of Liberty. Convinced that there was nothing to be expected from the cooperation of Northern Democrats, Thompson fell back once more upon his gang of escaped prisoners and other loose fish in Canada. The next scheme adopted by him was ingenious and audacious, and not without possibilities of success. He determined to capture the war steamer Michigan plying on Lake Erie, and with her to liberate the rebel prisoners on Johnson's Island in Sandusky Bay. The prisoners were then to march upon Cleveland, attacking that town by land and by water, and thence march through Ohio to gain Virginia. A man named Charles H. Cole, formerly one of Forrest's troopers, was sent round the lakes as a deck passenger to inform himself thoroughly of the approaches to the harbors, the depositories of coal, the stations and habits of the Michigan. He performed his task with energy and efficiency, and with great satisfaction and amusement to himself. He invented an oil corporation, of which he was president and board of directors, opened an office in Buffalo, and used a good deal of Thompson's money in making the acquaintance of the officers of the Michigan. The 19th of September was the day fixed for the attempt upon the Michigan, Cole having contrived to have himself invited to dine with the officers of the vessel on that day. A Virginian named John Yates Beall was assigned the more difficult and dangerous part of the enterprise. He, with 25 Confederates, took passage from Sandwich in Canada on board the Philo Parsons, an unarmed merchant vessel plying between Detroit and Sandusky. They were all armed with revolvers, and had no trouble in taking possession of the steamer and robbing the clerk of what money he had. They soon afterwards fell in with another unarmed steamer, the Island Queen, scuttled her, and then steered for Sandusky Bay to join Cole and the boats he had prepared in an attack upon the Michigan. But the plan miscarried. The military, aware of Cole's intentions, had captured him, and Beall, missing the signals which had been agreed upon, did not dare to proceed in the enterprise alone. He therefore returned to Sandwich, and his crew scattered through Canada. Beall was not content with the failure of this enterprise, and later in the season, in the middle of December, he was caught in the State of New York, near the Suspension Bridge, in an attempt to throw a passenger train from the west off the railroad track for the purpose of robbing the express company. This was the third attempt which he had made to accomplish this purpose. He was in citizen's dress, engaged in an act of simple murder and robbery, yet he imagined that the fact that he had a Confederate commission in his pocket would secure him against punishment in case of capture. He was tried by court-martial and sentenced to death. Jefferson Davis took the same view of the talismanic character of the Confederate commission upon which Beall had relied, and issued a manifesto assuming the responsibility of the act and declaring that it was done by his authority. There was great clamor in regard to the case, and many people of all parties pleaded with Mr. Lincoln to commute the sentence of Beall. A petition in this sense was signed by most of the Democratic members of the House of Representatives and by many Republicans, but the Judge Advocate General reported that Beall, convicted upon indubitable proof as a spy, guerrillero, outlaw, and would-be murderer of hundreds of innocent persons traveling in supposed security upon one of our great thoroughfares, fully deserved to die a felon's death, and the summary enforcement of that penalty was a duty which government owed to society. Loath as Mr. Lincoln was at all times to approve a capital sentence, he felt that in this case he could not permit himself to yield to the promptings of his kindly heart. He sent a private message to General Dix, saying he would be glad if he would allow Beall a respite of a few days to prepare himself for death, but positively declined to interfere with the sentence, and Beall was hung in the latter part of February. The Virginia Senate made his cause their own, and recommended by resolutions of the 3rd of March the adoption of such steps as might be necessary in retaliation for the offense committed by the authorities of the United States. Under Thompson's orders, the large prison camps in the North had been thoroughly examined with a view of effecting the release of the Confederate prisoners confined in them. But the attempts at different places were given up for one reason or another, and it was resolved to concentrate all the efforts of the conspirators upon Camp Douglas at Chicago. A large number of rebels and their sympathizers were gathered together in that city, and the plan for taking the prison camp with its 10,000 Confederate prisoners was matured, and was to have been put into execution on the night of Election Day, taking advantage of the excitement and the crowds of people in the streets to surprise the camp, release and arm the prisoners of war, cut the telegraph wires, burn the railway stations, and seize the banks and stores containing arms and ammunition. It was hoped that this would excite a simultaneous rising of the Sons of Liberty throughout the State and result in the release of the Confederate prisoners in other camps. But the plot, as usual, was betrayed by repentant rebels who were in the most secret councils of the conspirators. Shortly after midnight on the 7th of November, Colonel Benjamin J. Sweet, commanding Camp Douglas, trapped in their various hiding places and took prisoners all the leaders of the contemplated attack, among them John H. Morgan's Adjutant General, Saint Leger Grenfell, Colonel Marmaduke, a brother of the rebel general, the commanding officer of the Sons of Liberty in the State, and several other officers of the rebel army who were escaped prisoners. In one house they found 2 cartloads of revolvers loaded and capped, 200 stands of muskets loaded, and a large amount of ammunition. Mr. Thompson hesitated at nothing which he thought might injure the people of the United States. Any villain who approached him with a project of murder and arson was sure of a kindly reception. Soon after I reached Canada, he says, a Mr. Minor Major visited me and represented himself as an accredited agent from the Confederate States to destroy steamboats on the Mississippi River, and that his operations were suspended for want of means. I advanced to him $2,000 in Federal currency, and soon afterwards several boats were burned at St. Louis, involving an immense loss of property to the enemy. Money has been advanced to Mr. Churchill of Cincinnati to organize a corps for the purpose of incendiarism in that city. I consider him a true man, and although as yet he has effected but little, I am in constant expectation of hearing of effective work in that quarter. Another miscreant of the same type, named Colonel Martin, who brought an unsigned letter from Jefferson Davis to Thompson, expressed a wish to organize a corps to burn New York City. He was allowed to do so, says Mr. Thompson, and a most daring attempt has been made to fire that city, but their reliance on the Greek fire has proved a misfortune. It cannot be depended on as an agent in such work. I have no faith whatever in it, and no attempt shall hereafter be made under my general directions with any such materials. A party of 8 persons, mostly escaped prisoners, were sent to New York to destroy that city by fire. One of them, named Kennedy, was captured, tried, and hung. Before his execution, he confessed that he had set fire to 4 places: Barnum's Museum, Lovejoy's Hotel, Tammany Hotel, and the New England House. The others, he said, with a certain sense of wrong, only started fires where each was lodging and then ran off. Had they all done as I did, we would have had 32 fires and played a huge joke on the fire department. This stupid tool of baser men escaped to Canada. But relying, as Beall did, on his commission as a captain in the Confederate Army, he started once more for the Confederacy by way of Detroit and was arrested by detectives in the railway station. He had taken on a new name and a new character, and in his trial, among the evidence he brought forward, which he thought would insure his immunity, was a pledge given to the transportation agent in Canada to return with all due diligence to the Confederacy. Even after his sentence, he had no realization of the crime he had committed. He wrote to the President, arguing, as a matter of law, that death was too severe a penalty for arson, and suggesting that there was no need of punishing him as an example, since the execution of Beall had already served that purpose. If Mr. Thompson is to be believed, it would appear that his adherents in Canada were not altogether under discipline, and that they sometimes took the opportunity to indulge in casual burglaries and murders on their own account. He said in his official report that he knew nothing of the St. Albans affair until after it was over. This was a crime of unusual atrocity and bad fare for the moment to involve the most serious consequences. A party of Confederate thieves, some 20 or 30 strong, came over the border from Canada on the 19th of October, and entering the village of St. Albans in Vermont, they robbed the banks of some $250,000, accompanying this crime with entirely uncalled-for cruelty, firing upon the unarmed citizens, killing one man and wounding another. They also attempted to burn several houses. The raid was over in less than an hour, and the band, who had stolen horses enough in the vicinity to mount them all, immediately returned to Canada. It seemed at first as if the Canadian authorities intended to arrest the criminals and hold them for punishment, and Mr. Seward, 2 days afterwards, expressed his gratification to the British legation at Washington for this prompt and apparently satisfactory proceeding. As it turned out, however, he spoke too quickly, for Judge Coursol discharged the criminals from custody and restored to them the money they had stolen. As soon as this intelligence reached New York, General Dix, outraged beyond endurance by the iniquity of the act, without consultation with the government, issued an order directing all military commanders on the frontier, in case of further acts of depredation and murder, to shoot down the murderers or the persons acting under commissions from the rebel authorities at Richmond, and further instructing them that if it should be necessary, with a view to their capture, to cross the border between the United States and Canada, to pursue them wherever they might take refuge, and on no account to surrender them to the local authorities, but to send them to the headquarters of the Department of the East for trial and punishment by martial law. The President, who felt no less keenly than General Dix the wrong and outrage committed by these rebel murderers, and the Canadian authorities who seemed to be protecting them, nevertheless declined to allow any subordinate to embroil the country with a foreign nation in this way. And in spite of General Dix's vehement defense of what he called the right of hot pursuit, the President required him to revoke the instructions quoted. The British government directed Lord Monck, the Governor-General of Canada, to be guided by the decision of the proper legal authorities in the provinces, whether persons in custody ought or ought not to be delivered up under the treaty of extradition, saying that in case the decision were that they ought to be delivered, the government would approve Lord Monk's acting on this decision. And in case of the contrary decision, the government suggested that they should be put upon trial on the charge of misprision and violation of the royal prerogative by levying war from Her Majesty's dominions against a friendly power. The criminals whom Judge Coursol had released were again captured. The Canadian Parliament reproved the action of Coursol and suspended him from office. The prisoners having been once more arrested, the matter was heard before Mr. Justice Smith of Montreal, who again discharged them on the ground that Young, the ringleader of the party, bore a commission in the Confederate Army; that Mr. Clement C. Clay, an associate of Thompson's as Confederate commissioner, was aware of Young's purpose and gave him a check for $400 for his expenses. The attack on St. Albans, he said, must therefore be regarded as a hostile expedition undertaken and carried out under the authority of the so-called Confederate States by one of the officers of their army. He held that the prisoners had not acquired any domicile in Canada, nor lost their national character by their residence there. The government of Canada was not satisfied with this pettifogging plea, and arrested the prisoners anew; but the war having now come to an end, the case was languidly prosecuted, and the criminals received no punishment. The Canadian authorities, however, desiring to maintain amicable relations with the United States and to do substantial justice in the case in spite of the courts, refunded $58,000 of the money stolen by the raiders, being the gold value of some $87,000, which was in their possession when they came into the custody of the Canadian courts, and an attempt was made in the provincial legislature to pass a law which should prevent the setting on foot of such unlawful expeditions from Canadian soil in the future. End of chapter 1.